In this episode, we're stepping out of the moonlight and into the shadow of one of the most enduring figures in horror and folklore. From the chilling legends of European forests to the slick, modern takes on the big screen. Grab your silver bullets and lock your doors as we go looking for werewolves. Here we go. And here we are again for another episode of Paranormal Popcast. I am Nick.
And I'm Vin.
And today we're talking about werewolves. So Vin, it's so funny. You had sent me this video about this Dr. Juliet Wood, I think her name was, who
I forgot
questions
what that,
about
yeah.
folklore. And one of the questions was how werewolves are kind of connected with vampires. And I hadn't really thought about that, but you're so right. It's like there's a lot of vampire stories where werewolves kind of play a role. What is it about werewolves you think? You think one is, I think vampires kind of dominate when it comes to pop culture, but werewolves are like a close second, I would think.
Werewolves are, again, when we do these things, I start thinking about them more than I have before, like where did they come from and things like that. I think the one thing that struck me and why I think werewolves in pop culture aren't quite like I remember as a kid, werewolves were along with Dracula and Frankenstein, and it was one of the monsters, right? But they do seem to have sort of like a little second fiddle, right? To the Frankensteins and Draculas and stuff. But really because I think there's no one central character for werewolves, right? There's not, you have vampires, you could do Twilight and all this stuff, but Dracula is the central character.
You're right.
You don't have a lot of Frankenstein monsters, but even Frankenstein became his own character. Like, as a kid, like, you have that, moment of revelation when you realize that the monster's name isn't Frankenstein.
Right.
Or, I mean, in the cartoons and stuff, it is. But that wasn't actually the name of the creature. So, but it's taken on that persona. And there's really not a werewolf persona, but it still has, I think, some of the same trappings of any of the paranormal monsters, certainly that we've talked about so far, and has just sort of grabbed onto the pop culture, mainstream, people's attention. People are interested in them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can like look and see if there is any werewolf character that has kind of grabbed people by storm. And I would say the Wolfman, I guess, in the Universal Monster series is probably the closest we came, because then there was a series of those movies with that Larry Talbot character who becomes the Wolfman. But you're right. It's like when people think werewolf, there's a lot of different characters that they think of. When they think vampires, there are a lot of characters, but Dracula kind of dominates. And then, of course, Frankenstein's monster is like, but there is that universal series of monsters, and the Wolfman and werewolves, it's definitely one of the,
You just reminded me when you said that Wolverine, too.
Yeah, I was going to say, we were going to talk about that. Is Wolverine technically like a werewolf? Like, a Wolverine and a wolf are different, but it is. That came up in some of my research. I was like, Wolverine, really? I never really thought of him as a kind of a werewolf type character. But yeah, it's like a kind of a hybrid of this like wolfish, Wolverine-ish kind of thing. But yeah.
But you were saying about the sort of pantheon of monster characters. Were you going to like continue with that? I don't know.
No, I was just going to say how it is kind of, it just falls into that. It is an icon. The werewolf is one of those icons. Right. We looked at other things, Bigfoot, and, there's like the Mothman and all these, mermaids and different things in folklore and the paranormal. And the werewolf kind of is one of those icons that, and it's just, it's interesting. When you think of a werewolf now, do you think of a creature that looks exactly like a wolf, but is transitions, like goes from human to that wolf? Or is it that kind of hybrid, like the Wolfman in the Universal, where it's kind of humanoid? And I think is where we kind of,
I think in general, if I'm hearing werewolf, I'm thinking first of Young Frankenstein, werewolf, their
Where?
wolf,
Where?
their castle. If you've seen Young Frankenstein, if you know, you know. But why are you talking like that? Anyway, the what was I saying? The werewolf itself, I think more of like that hybrid of someone transforming into a a humanoid, probably more beast, but like the shape of the body is still there. It's not completely down into like a four-legged wolf.
Mhm,
It's more like monstrous, almost a form of Bigfoot in some
mhm.
ways, but
In
like,
many ways, yeah, you're
you
right.
know,
They live in the woods. They're like,
the head is a wolf. That's what I said. Like when it's fully transformed, the head is like a
mm,
wolf's head, but the body is more like is more humanoid, sort of walks semi-erect or
yeah.
runs. That's what I personally picture.
Yeah. And I guess just to before we leave the vampire thing for a bit, but there are, in stories of vampires where a vampire turns into a wolf and then turns into a bat. And so that is part of almost like what they are. Like a werewolf and a vampire kind of almost are like connected. And there's stories where the werewolf is like the familiar of the vampire. Like they're subservient to them and they work with them. And then there's all these great stories where they battle each other and, all the team ups, in the Universal movies and in the ones that have come later down the road. But I guess, you could go back as both vampires and werewolves kind of come from folklore, from these
Right.
stories that people would tell about, just believing that they really exist and they see a wolf out there and they might think there's something supernatural about that wolf. That it's not just a regular wolf. Maybe it is, this hybrid that is, something that's turned into a wolf and used to be human.
Yeah.
And of course, the curse, right? In a lot of these stories, the werewolf has been cursed, and that's why they're a werewolf. Either they've been bitten by another werewolf, same thing with a vampire, right? That's how they become
Yeah.
these creatures. Or it's been a curse that's been passed on for generation after generation. So that's interesting. I find that. And you look at a lot of these fairy tales from folklore, Little Red Riding Hood, and, the Three Little Pigs, and
Yeah.
all these, the wolf is this, it's a talking wolf usually, so it
Hmm.
is and then, later adaptations now have taken it and turned it into part of that werewolf mythology. So what do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's sort of a lot, happening here in the sense of could talk about the vampires and that connection. I did find, I guess I'll start because I don't want to jump around too much, but in terms of like the folklore and um the 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 notion of werewolves being devils
Mhm,
and cursed and things like that. I found an interesting tidbit was that in 1500s and 1600s there were werewolf trials similar to witch trials, and it was sort of the same type of thing with the witch trials where they were people were accused of turning into wolves and
mm,
of murdering children and
yeah,
making pacts with the devil, and all that. And so what was mentioned was, let me see if I can find this, the trial of Peter Stump, Stumpp. And this was in Germany, and there were witch hunts, and he was accused of being a werewolf, murdering 14 to 16 people. He was accused of cannibalism, consorting with the devil, but the the significance of this, according to what I mean, I basically found this online, but the significance is this is where this particular case was where the werewolf turned into this cursed devil worshiping or, associated with the devil. And before that, it was mythic. It was more
mm,
like folklore and myths and things like that. But that's where apparently the transition happened, where we got that more
interesting.
association with evil and with the devil. But I think werewolves in general, some of the things I thought about was that there's a relationship between humans and wolves because wolves evolved into, when they domesticated,
Right.
became dogs. So I think there was always like this connection to them, and there's sort of associated with the primal,
Hmm.
right? So like I think in folklore and, in ancient cultures or whatever, it could be, that could be the connection between the two, where some of this folklore developed, because there was a
Yeah.
stronger relationship between human and animal in this case. I mean, I think too, like if you think of other creatures in the wild, like bears or lions or mountain lions or whatever, there's you keep your distance from those
Right.
creatures. There really isn't like a closer relationship, but wolves, as dangerous predators as they were and are, I think were in closer proximity too. And, one of the things that was used a lot was the wearing of wolf pelts. And I think that idea of getting power from the skin of the wolf and wearing them, I think that all played into what, became folklore, and then, grew into, of course, when we come into modern times and you have mass media and everything, it transformed into sort of the pop culture iterations
Yeah.
that come about from all the things we've talked about. But it's an interesting, I think, progression in the case of wolves and then werewolves.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thing you bring up about the wolf itself, because there are so many like indigenous people stories about shapeshifters and different animals like deer, and you mentioned bears and eagles and things like that. But it's something about the wolf that has kind of ingrained itself into our cultural imagination and become the werewolf. Like you see even stories where they've tried to make it like, wear a lion or wear something else, but it's the wolf that. And I guess how you bring it up, how the connection with the dog, like we are so close to that animal, and it is a domesticated version of this wild canine, right? And the wolf is still that wild primal character, right? And I think that is something that resonates a lot. And I guess when you look at, how this folklore developed and how these stories came up, there are stories of like even modern times where, some people genetically have more hair on their face, right? And people looked at them back then in the day.
I'm gray now, so you can't tell. Exactly. I
But,
can go
there is
two
that
days
genetic,
without
I
shaving
don't know
now.
if it's a disease or what the deal is, but like,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
werewolf, thing. And, I guess too, just like in ancient times, like when I did my vampire episode, Dracula episode for the Greatest Characters podcast,
Mhm.
we talked about how the whole lore of vampires came into being, and some of it comes from like people were buried alive and they didn't know that. And then when they dug them up, they would see blood and they're like, "Oh my God, it's got to be, a
Coming out of
vampire."
the grave
So the
at
same
night
thing
or
with
whatever, yeah.
werewolves. And the full moon, there is this thing where it's like when there is a full moon, it kind of brings out the lunacy in a lot of people. Like there's more
Yeah.
crimes, people go. I mean, I don't know the science behind that and what causes it, but it is a phenomenon that people have been studying. So I can imagine back in the time when people were like, yeah, these people must be turning into these monsters
Yeah.
whenever there's a full moon. When there's a full moon, be careful. So it's like it's really interesting how sometimes this fictional great stories that we love now might have some grain of truth in terms of how they developed and how they became what they were, right?
Right, and I imagine that while, the indigenous, people, or, pre, um, pre-civilization, cultures that were, hunter-gatherers living, on plains, or even in Europe and Asia, hearing the the howling cannot be, a comfortable thing. That it had to raise some sort of imaginative response, I would think, because I'm not sure that other animals do something quite like that. Like when I think about it, I couldn't think of like bears or buffalo or anything howling at the moon, like, and whether they're howling at the moon, if that's, I'm not even sure if that's a real thing, but I think it is.
I mean, it is a phrase
But
that's been used forever, you know, it's
yeah,
like
but for humans, the sky and celestial objects were objects of, religious significance, of all kinds of significance. And this is the only animal that sort of seems to have some sort of connection to it too, you know?
yeah.
I thought was interesting too when I was thinking about like how where we associate with wolves, there's two like contradicting notions when it comes to wolves. Like we talk about a lone wolf, right?
Mhm.
That's like
Yep.
saying, but wolves are run in packs,
Mhm.
but also running in a pack. Like a pack of wolves is something that
Yeah.
we associate with as well, metaphorically, running with the wolves and being a lone wolf
Yeah.
are two things that are in our, cultural lexicon, but same animal, but a completely different concept.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I don't know, like
Yeah.
if they relate at all to me. That's what struck me. I'm like they're the opposite of each other.
And you've seen that with like the Wolfman, which we mentioned, and we'll go into more detail, but that's a lone wolf kind of storyline where it's like a single person cursed and trying to survive. And then you have all these other stories, Underworld, the Twilight Saga, where it's like
Hmm.
a pack, where it's a group of them.
Yeah.
And it's like they are with their own kind of, so it's like, it is interesting. It does follow that kind of natural storyline. Like, I guess you wouldn't, in nature, you wouldn't see a lone wolf, right? Like you see one wolf and you're like, okay, there must be a pack out there. They must have, you know, a den somewhere,
Unless there
unless it's
was
lost from their pack, right?
or there was or yeah, there were the occasional lone wolf and it was
Hmm.
significant and
Yeah.
that developed some sort of
Yep.
mythos surrounding
Right.
surrounding the lone wolf, someone who doesn't run with the pack. So maybe there
Exactly.
were, maybe it had rabies, but like,
Right.
but the metaphor comes then, I guess, develops.
Yeah. So in terms of pop culture then, so it's been part of folklore, like all these other things, ghosts and vampires and other things. So people start telling stories about it. So you had the fairy tales and you had,
Right.
the myths. But then in modern times, you had a nonfiction book called The Book of Werewolves in 1865 by Sabine Baring Gould. And then the first work of fiction that I guess really became popular was this story, The Werewolf of Paris, in
Mhm.
1933 by Guy Endor, and that became one of the inspirations for the Wolfman stories by Universal. Universal was just looking for anything supernatural to
Yeah.
keep churning this out. They did Dracula, the Frankenstein story, so they're like the Mummy. They're like, okay, werewolf, let's do the werewolf story. And the Wolfman, I think, was one of the greatest little horror stories of its time. Do you recall seeing it? Is that, or do you just see bits and pieces? I mean, it's become so
I
part of
probably saw
pop
bits
culture.
and pieces. I was think as a kid I liked Frankenstein the most
Yeah, me
and
too.
Dracula's, but poor Wolfman doesn't
And then later, I like
yeah,
the creature
he
from the
was like
Black
a
Lagoon,
lower
the Gill
tier.
Man, and the Invisible Man. There's so many great Universal monsters.
But yeah, they were certainly you're right. I mean, they were pulling out whatever
Uh-huh.
folklore thing they could pull out because I mean, those movies were really popular,
Yeah.
you know.
And it's the kind of story I think that inspired later ones. Like you think like the Incredible Hulk and things like that,
Yeah.
about a person who just can't control this transformation into this monster. And the Larry Talbot character, played by Lon Chaney Jr., is very sympathetic. He didn't want to be a
Hmm.
monster. He gets bitten by Bela Lugosi, who plays the monster that's cursed and bites him and then there's all that mythological stuff about the curse and the full moon and all the things that we associate now with like their weaknesses are silver and wolfsbane
Yeah.
and again, religious icons too in some of these
Right.
stories, like with vampires. But the silver being like something about, purity, I guess.
Yeah.
And just the moon, the story about, turning. To me, I think that would be like a storytelling crutch, wouldn't you think? Or like a problem because, okay, it's only happening once a month. So you can only have these adventures. But you have then sometimes they have a talisman or they have some other
Yeah.
magic that makes them turn not just when it's a full moon, But so that's a storytelling device that they use to kind of get around that little loophole where it's like, all right, we could really only tell the story once every 30 days or 20 something days. Right? So,
Right. I think the full moon also, it helps with the suspense,
yeah,
but I guess, yeah, from a storytelling point of view, you can't like survive a night and then say 1 month later, 4 weeks later,
exactly.
and then you build up the suspense again.
I know, because then you'd be in trouble. Like, how would you get by it? But Lon Chaney Jr., I mean, his dad was really well known in all these silent movies for
Hmm.
being a master of disguise and makeup and turning into these monsters. He played Phantom of the Opera, and he played the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So here's like, how do you top dad? And you
Yeah.
become the Wolfman. And then he played Frankenstein's monster, and he played all these other characters too. So but he's known for the Wolfman. Like, he made a
Hmm.
bunch of these, the sequels, and I just think he's so great because he comes across as sympathetic when he's Larry, and then he becomes the monster, and it's humanoid. It's one of those real, that's the one thing I feel bad about, like Creature from the Black Lagoon. You can't really express much with the makeup,
Yeah.
but with the werewolf, it's really, it's like he's a human being with a lot of fur and fangs, and but super strength and agility and you know
Well, I think that's you touch on one of the, I guess, strengths or really like great things about pop culture is that you see, we're talking about the background of the Wolfman or whatever we're talking about, or the werewolf, and you see where it comes from, right? And you see where like the association with the devil comes in, and you have this mythos that's now been built up. And then you move into the pop culture sphere, and creative people, writers, directors, actors start investigating the possibilities,
yeah,
and what might this really be like. Could if maybe you're not evil, maybe you have no control, becomes a metaphor for control, comes a metaphor for the demon inside of all of us, or whatever, or struggles. It becomes, all these kind of, you could use it for allegory. So I think, and especially the werewolf, because you even, touched on that when you talked about that he's a sympathetic
yeah.
character. I think there's a lot in there. And maybe there's not a central character because the werewolf, and I don't want to jump ahead, but you did mention Jekyll and Hyde
Oh yeah,
in our notes, but the without being a central character, there's a broader relationship with what the werewolf is. It's
hmm,
more about inner struggles and all that stuff. And maybe it just doesn't lend itself as much to a central character rather than just exploring sort of the duality, right? I mean, you wouldn't, and again, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but when I talk about duality, that is like in the Lord of the Rings with Gollum,
hmm,
like one side and the other side, and, the light and the dark,
yeah,
that transformation from good and evil, and, what is evil, and, are you evil if you're good, but there's this transformation that you don't have control over. So there's a lot to explore there, but, I think that may be why the werewolf is sort of to the side of those other monsters a little bit.
yeah. And when I did my Jekyll and Hyde episode in the Greatest Characters podcast, we talked a little bit about that and about how we talked about good and evil, the two sides, but like how Jekyll and Hyde was really, he was evil to begin with, you know,
Yeah.
and so this is kind of like that notion where it's like the werewolf has always been in us, like that side.
Yeah.
And it's like it takes this curse or this being bitten by another werewolf or something to kind of bring it out.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with like the Hulk storyline, where it's like in current storylines, it's like the Hulk was always part of Dr. Banner. It's like it took that gamma radiation to bring him out.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting when it's like it's not that we're suddenly becoming this new monster. It's like the primal instinct that is in human beings is now being unleashed. So I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that plays up with a lot of these metaphors, especially later than when we did the teenage werewolf, the Michael Landon, a movie. I was
Mhm.
a Teenage Werewolf. And it plays on that storyline of teenagers and how they're going from these innocent kids and now suddenly hormones and everything is changing us and we're becoming,
Yeah.
we can't control our instincts.
Yeah.
And that became this great metaphor for, for that. And especially at a time when being a teenager was suddenly becoming a thing. Like before then, you really only had kids becoming adults, and then suddenly
Right. Yeah.
being a teenager became like this stage in life. So have you ever seen, there was also Teen Wolf down, in the 80s.
I saw Teen Wolf in the 80s. I have not seen I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Um, but Teen Wolf, I mean, I think I saw that movie in bits and pieces. I don't remember it that well. I just remember he, played basketball and,
Yeah, Michael J. Fox.
Michael J. But
And then
yeah,
the
I mean, I
sequel the
think,
sequel with, Jason Bateman, and then they turned it into an
right.
MTV series, so that had some life in it.
But Michael J. Fox, his kind of style of acting was that jittery, kind of
Yeah,
nervous, unsure
right.
kid that he was playing. And I think to what you're saying, that the notion of the werewolf is playing into that teenage anxiety and
Oh, yeah.
teenage angst. And, to me, because I was older when that came out, but my brother, who's 9 years younger than me, he was more, I think, in the age of liking that movie. But, I couldn't understand its popularity.
I mean, it wasn't really a monster movie, right? It
No,
was
it
like
wasn't a
he
monster
suddenly
movie.
becomes a basketball star for his high school, right? And
Yeah,
it's like
it was it just was like, I guess, to me, kind of cringe, like as a I wouldn't say, because I don't think I was a teenager. I think it was sort of, I was more in college
okay.
when that came out, and it was just, I think I remember thinking it was kind of ridiculous, but after a while I saw it, and
Yeah.
you know it's just like a
Uh-huh.
fun,
Yeah.
80s comedy.
Yeah. And then
But
again, I haven't
yeah,
seen the Teen Wolf, the new ones. And apparently they take that a little bit more seriously and darker, and then they made a movie version of that too, based on the TV series. But I should check them out a little bit more. I mean, before the Wolfman, you had Universal do Werewolf of London in 1935, starring Henry
hmm
Hull, but that didn't connect as much as the Wolfman. The Wolfman was the one that really was huge. Then he comes back in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and then the last time we saw Lon Chaney Jr. play the role was in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So that was when Universal was just blending all these monsters.
yeah,
And it's what we started the show talking about. It's like how it fit when you talk about a bunch of monsters, especially the Universal monsters, the werewolf character is part of it. I remember the
yeah.
Monster Squad in the 1980s or 90s, whenever that aired. That was fun too. You had Frankenstein's monster, you had Dracula, and you had the Wolfman. And it is part of those core monsters.
Well, also when we were younger, and we were kids and watching cartoons, those, I guess, the Hanna-Barbera and
Mhm.
whatever other Saturday morning cartoons, a lot of them, continued on from, I guess, the 50s and 60s, those monster
Yeah.
characters, in different ways. They weren't, of course, as culturally, they were just morning cartoons, but yeah, there was just this cast of characters, Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, the Mummy.
Yeah. Exactly. And then, you had the Scooby Gang going after some werewolf, and you had Alvin
Yeah,
and the Chipmunks. There was always some episode where there was a werewolf. It's just an easy kind of storyline. It's a
yeah,
full moon, especially around Halloween. You're looking for something. Werewolf is really
yeah,
easy to do. Then it's interesting then that since a werewolf is so significant, that the Hammer movies that kind of try to bring back all these Universal monsters. They did a bunch of Dracula movies, a bunch of Frankenstein movies. They only did one werewolf movie. It was The Curse of the Werewolf, starring Oliver Reed. I don't know if you ever saw that one, but the iconic look of him with like the white fur, and it's
uh-huh,
like I was amazed that they didn't make more werewolf movies, and I wonder if it was the makeup effects that were the issue. Because again, the Dracula movies, you didn't have to worry too much about too much Dracula. A lot of fake blood,
yeah,
but same thing with the Frankenstein movies. It's like, yeah, you had makeup, but you didn't have to go all out. And
yeah,
then, until like the 1980s when they really had the budget to do those transformations, and I guess American Werewolf in London, directed by John Landis, had that great transformation where it's just like
Yeah.
you believed that this human being could become, because it was realistic. It wasn't just the wolf man where it's like a furry face, and fangs. It was like his face was becoming a werewolf, and you could see the pain of just his arms stretching into like
Yeah.
claws. That was creepy when I was younger watching that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I saw that back in the day, and again, I don't remember it so much, but I remember those shots. But I watched The Howling the other day just to, check out
I
another
love
movie.
those movies.
They did a good job in the transformation too.
Hmm.
Not quite what an American Werewolf in London did, but I see what you're saying. I think that's a good point,
Yeah.
that the whole idea of the monster is the transformation, and so you can't have like a couple of whiskers, and it can't be like Superman spinning around in the phone booth and coming out. Like,
Yeah.
you're right. It was another challenge in doing justice to the idea of the werewolf and the wolf man.
Yeah. Yeah. The Howling, I loved. I loved The Howling. I loved The Howling 2 when those came out. And that was like the early eight. I guess that's when it started like picking up again. There was that moment when it was like there was a bunch of wolf movies out. You had Wolfen, you had Stephen King had his Cycle of the Werewolf book out, and then they turned it into Silver Bullet. So it just felt like there was a lot. There was that weird one by Neil Jordan, The Company of Wolves. Did you remember seeing that when we were younger? Where it kind of played off of Little Red Riding Hood. Very artsy. I remember seeing the commercials for it and be like, I have to see this movie. And I would go, and it wasn't for kids. It wasn't like, it was more of an adult kind of, but it was also very artsy and not a straightforward storyline. So if you were going in thinking it was going to be like The Wolf Man,
Uh-huh.
where it's like this drama. It was very metaphorical, very, but it's become a cult classic. I think a lot of people look into it now. It's still not huge. People probably don't even know what it is, but The Company of Wolves was one that I remember just the way they hyped it. I wanted to see it. And again, it was playing off of the folklore and those fairy tale stories of the wolf. So that was really interesting back in the day. So I don't know if you ever had a chance to catch it on, you know, on cable or anything. Company of Wolves is one that I remember.
No, I don't remember that one at all. Like, something like that was being hyped. I think, that what I was surprised at a little bit with The Howling, because I hadn't, if I saw it, it was a long time ago, and I didn't watch like the whole series of them. But it seemed to me that, when you got to the end of the first one, there was clearly, this is moving on. It's the beginning
Yeah,
of a story. And it just seemed to me, I think it probably had more to do that, following the footsteps of like the Halloween and Friday the 13th, I think,
right,
which
right.
probably came right before, and they were doing sequels. But it struck me as more the way they're doing movies now, where you're
Mm,
just booting up a franchise. And it just seemed odd to me that in 1981, I think that was
yeah,
made, that they created a movie that really clearly looked like they were launching a franchise,
yeah,
that they didn't intend, Howling 2. They had, they intended 3, 4, 5, and
right.
6,
Yeah,
and because, and I don't want to give away the ending, give away any spoilers, but it just
spoilers.
really looked like this is the beginning of the story. Like, that's what it wasn't like loose ends. It was
Yeah.
just like, this is where we're starting off of.
And I liked it so much. I remember wanting it to be like a series. Like I wanted more. And I remember the sequel. I really enjoyed the sequel, Howling 2. Your sister is a werewolf, right? I thought that was
Yeah.
pretty cool. But then it kind of fizzled out. It didn't really. I lost interest in some of the other. They was going on maybe straight to video or something. Some of them, but they did a lot of them, and I think it was kind of tying into the slasher trend at the time.
Yeah.
You mentioned, Friday the 13th, and you had Halloween. What better, a werewolf is kind of like this slasher kind of creature and monster that's going out there, and you have to survive against them, but you could still tell the story from the point of view of the people who are turning into these monsters, right? So
You
it's
could
not just
also Yeah, you could also, I think, if you're looking at slasher movies, there's the ability to be a little bit more graphic with the
Mm,
werewolf,
mhm.
right? Because that's how they attack. It's an animal.
Yeah.
Less so than Dracula or Frankenstein or the Mummy or like whatever,
Mm.
whatever you're looking at. This I think fit into this ability to do a more graphic movie.
And then, you had other I mean, for some reason, they don't stick as much as some of these others, but you had Jack Nicholson do a movie called Wolf, where he was,
Hmm.
this werewolf. They did a remake with Benicio del Toro, right? Of The Wolf Man, trying to relaunch that. Universal's been trying to relaunch its monster franchises, and it just seems like it hasn't clicked. They just did another one, Wolfman, which the trailer looks good, but I didn't get a chance to go see it in the movie theater, and it kind of came and went. But it was meant to be again. This person just gets bitten by a wolf and turns into a werewolf, and his family is impacted, right? So it's like the story is there where you can reimagine this and do it over and over again. But for some reason, I guess even in TV, when you have True Blood, that werewolves played a role in that. They're always like secondary to like the vampires, or almost like just, they're not really something that like hits hard and becomes a cultural phenomenon, right? I mean, I could be wrong,
It's
but
well, I think no, I think you're right, and I think it just goes towards this thing where the werewolf just occupies a very strange spot
mm,
because you could look at, because I'm even thinking of, like the transformation of, Spider-Man or whatever,
mhm,
like people, they're just superheroes in general. But in the end, they transform, even if they're a superhero, or even if it's like Dracula, who can go out into the world as, say, like a gentleman
mm,
or something, and then it turns out he's a vampire. They're not turning into something that is an animal and not human, right? The monster is also a character, and the werewolf, once you turn into the werewolf, you're not really a character anymore.
mm.
Right? You know what I'm saying? Like, what do you do with the werewolf when he's a werewolf,
Just a
right?
monster, right, attacking you and just
Yeah,
wow.
it's just a beast. Like
Mhm,
even the Hulk has more character. I mean,
mhm.
maybe there's a way to present it where like Teen Wolf was a basketball player.
Right.
Maybe that's why Teen Wolf was. I mean, there you go, really, because that was that's like one of the most popular movies.
Yeah,
But he was a character when he was the wolf as
yeah,
well, and I think that's the thing. If you pull it back and sort of go halfway with your transformation, is he really a werewolf?
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, like
it's a tricky when you come to pop culture, it's got to work as a story.
yeah, yeah, but otherwise they're kinda like secondary. You got Eddie Munster, right, the little son who's a werewolf boy, but he's just
Wolf
a,
Boy.
secondary character, right? And then yeah, I mean, in the Twilight movies, right? You had one of them again, secondary to the vampires. But, it's just I mean, you've had some that have been successful, like the Ginger Snaps movies. I don't know if you saw those, but they, played up on, that those were pretty good. And then you have TV shows like Hemlock Grove and things like that that are like they struck a chord with viewers,
Hmm.
but not like super mainstream. Now there's a cartoon that my daughter loves called Wolf Walkers that came out in 2020. I haven't seen it yet, so I have to check that out.
Well, because it jumps in on that Skinwalker,
Yeah, yeah,
that's why I laughed. It's like it's a wolf walker now
yeah, yeah,
rather than this, evil paranormal creature.
yeah. And then you've got video games where it's like I think sometimes the most interesting use of werewolves is it's a playable character
Yeah.
where you can be and that's cool because it's like a superhero. It has super strength, super hearing, super senses, right? So I think out of all the monsters that we've talked about in like the Universal lineup, it's the closest to being a superhero, isn't it? Right? I think.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Dracula is the closest to being a supervillain. But and I guess yeah, it's if if they can talk a little bit more or something like that, maybe it would have a little bit more resonance.
It
But
lends itself good.
no, no, yeah.
No, it lends itself to video games though, because
Oh,
that's,
absolutely.
that's even any video game has that you power up and you
Yeah.
transform into something else, whether
Yeah,
it's
you could
Super
become
Mario
like the
games or
hybrid, then you could
whatever.
become the full one, right? You can
Yeah,
become a super
so
werewolf,
like
right?
that idea of transitioning into a monster to just
Yeah.
like slash your way through through a level is, yeah, that's perfect for video games.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in comics, Marvel did an adaptation of their comic from '72 called Werewolf by Night, and I thought that was really well done. They did it in black and white, and it was really cool. But the one werewolf character we mentioned, Wolverine, as a possibility of being werewolf adjacent, all right?
Yeah.
But Man-Wolf, I don't know if you remember if you were reading Marvel comics, but that was
I
like the
remember
secondary.
Man Wolf, but,
Yeah, he was an
like
astronaut. He was the son of J. Jonah Jameson, and it makes sense. Astronaut with the moon, right? And then that
right.
becomes the curse. I was surprised that character never picked up full steam, or especially now with the Marvel universe on in movies, that they didn't play up on that. I think they mentioned the character in one or two of the movies, but we haven't seen him yet. And I think that would be great storyline. I mean, I think that's,
Yeah.
he's not really a villain. He's not really superhero. He's connected to the Spider-Man universe, and you would think Sony would want to make, because they did Venom and they did, all these other,
Yeah.
Morbius and everything else, Madam Web. Why not Man Wolf? They if they had the rights, I would like make a movie out of that. But yeah, so that was pretty good. And then the Archie comics, they went into horror for a little while and turned them into zombies and things like that. And Jughead was a werewolf.
Anything for a buck. Let's try this.
I think that's awesome. And then music. I mean, it's like Werewolves of London was huge. And then
Mhm.
Thriller, Michael Jackson. That Thriller video
Yeah.
again,
Yeah,
directed by
yeah.
John Landis. There's that point where they turn into zombies, and then he also turns into a werewolf at the end. I love that. That's really really great. And Michael Jackson he was a little nervous about doing anything with the occult.
Right.
It
I
impacted his
remember that,
religious
yeah.
beliefs a little bit, but I mean, that was like a movie. It wasn't just a music video. That was like a nice 15-minute long, just wonderful. Nice homage to the horror genre, and the special effects were great, and it was really good. Any other ones that you saw, or you recommend seeing? I'm looking through my list now because I know there's a bunch that we left out.
Yeah, what was surprising is because, like, I was going through your list and I was finding I haven't actually watched a lot of Wolfman, or werewolf movies, but, as we're talking about it, I kind of see why. Like, there isn't like that, you know, quintessential, landmark werewolf movie. I mean, we know the ones that we talked about that were, the most, prominent of what's been made, but like there isn't, the one that everyone can point to that we can just say, oh yeah, well, there's
Mhm.
that. But I did, want to mention there was when you talked about like there's ones like Jekyll and Hyde and
Mhm.
Incredible Hulk, they're in that shape shifting thing. One that gets forgotten about is, and I don't know if you remember this character, is Bjorn in The Hobbit.
Okay.
Have you read The Hobbit?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of
Do you
my.
remember do you remember that character?
I'm trying. I mean, did it when they? Because I'm like, the movies now have been kind of taken over from when I read it
Yeah,
as a
and the
kid,
Hobbit movie
and
was
I don't
like
think
it's
they
not
had
really The Hobbit.
exactly. But was that a werewolf
It
character? Like,
was he turned into a bear.
okay.
But, like, that was a little bit closer to me to a wolf
Hmm.
than, like, say, Jekyll and Hyde or
Yeah.
The Incredible Hulk, that, in this book, Tolkien really did have a shape-shifting character. This character was a benevolent character
Hmm.
who helped the group. A certain point in the book, I forgot exactly where it is now. It's been a while since I read The Hobbit the last
Hmm.
time. But he also was, I think it was the Battle of the Five Armies, and it was sort of like, after everything was over, it was like Bjorn showed up too, you know? He was like, he was there killing people.
Nice.
But yeah, I thought that's an interesting character, not a wolf, but
Mhm.
certainly closer, I think, to the werewolf than, you know, a lot of the adjacent sort
Yeah.
of shapeshifters we talked about. And then there's the fantasy series Wheel of Time, which of course is one of the biggest fantasy series of
Yep.
all time. And there's three main characters in it, and Matt and Perrin, and they all have their own sort of storylines that thread through the entire series. They're the three most
Mhm.
prominent characters. It's what it's about. But Perrin is a wolf. He
Okay.
he becomes he's not bitten. It's supposedly kind of like in him, and it's brought out. But then he's able to, in a sense, like, or in dreams, like run with the pack of wolves,
Hmm.
and he communicates with the wolves through
Interesting.
dreams, and his eyes transform to yellow, and he doesn't like transform into a wolf, but like his mannerisms become wolf-like. But it's very much, it's a huge part of that series is the connection to a wolf, because he's a wolf brother is what
Nice.
he's called in it. So that's that. And then Game of Thrones, which a lot of Game of Thrones, I think, is lifted from Wheel of Time. But there's, you know, the dire wolves,
Yeah, I was gonna
and
think about talking about the
there's the
direwolves. Yeah.
connection there. It's actually similar to Wheel of Time, but not as direct. You know,
Interesting.
like there's not, but there's definitely that connection to wolves. And actually, I may be wrong. I don't know that George R. R. Martin borrowed that much from Wheel of Time. He might have. Tad Williams, and he had written a story. That I never finished, Shadow March, also had the same trope with a connection to wolves.
Hmm. It just seems like
And
a
so
natural
that,
fit. Like, it just seems
yeah,
like a
so those,
natural story elements, part of mythology.
yeah,
It's like
that
when you do these
trope,
fantasy stories, you have to throw in like elves and dragons and, wizards and shapeshifters, for sure.
right? And they're mystical. Like
Mhm.
if you associate them with the moon, they
Mhm.
become mystical in some sense. So that trope has definitely been, a part of fantasy literature. There's probably plenty more that I'm just not thinking of. And the one other personality, Wolfman Jack. Do you remember
Yes.
Wolfman
His
Jack?
whole persona seemed to be playing on the Wolfman, right?
Yeah.
He was a great DJ in the 1960s, right? But playing on the
Yeah.
nostalgia of the 50s.
I
And
looked him
he was
up a
huge in the
little bit.
'70s, and when we were growing up, like, his character, he was, like, on a bunch of cameos in sitcoms and, but yeah, he was an icon, and I think he played on that whole, Wolfman trope for his
I want
persona,
to, because I
right?
looked him up, you know, the always reliable Wikipedia, but
May it
they
live on
had,
forever now that AI is taken over, right?
exactly.
But yeah, he's Wolfman Jack was a great character. His whole thing with the howling and the look, he
Yeah.
had that little beard going
Here,
on and
his, I guess his name is Robert Weston Smith.
okay.
Let's see. The character was based in part on the manner and style of bluesman Howling Wolf. He first began to develop his famous alter ego, Wolfman Jack. According to author Philip Lieberman, Smith's Wolfman persona derived from Smith's love of horror films and his shenanigans as a wolfman with his two young nephews.
There you go.
And the Jack nickname was taken from the hipster lingo of the 1950s.
Yeah.
So,
I remember him very, very
yeah.
fondly. I remember he was just like one of those characters that was just famous for being famous. And then you learn he was a DJ and he did have, I think he
He
was.
was influential. They said he did a lot to promote black artists,
Uh-huh.
and, you know, playing rock and roll, I guess, even where rock and roll was not,
Hmm.
still was growing and there was resistance to it. But that was interesting. But yeah, like, as his career went on, and I guess he grew out of some of that, he really, you know, became part of, I don't know if like if he was doing like adult type shows, but like as
Hmm.
a kid, he
Yeah.
was personality was part of children's television.
Oh, yeah.
I think, right?
Like I
You know
said,
what
I
I mean?
remember
Like, yeah.
him vividly. Um, then there were, like, a lot of other like, there was a great, uh, Professor Lupin in the Harry Potter series,
Oh,
like
yes.
Prisoner of Azkaban. So, again, you do a fantasy series and you gotta throw in, like, a Wolfman character, like some kind of,
Yeah.
you know? Um, one movie that I have to mention is, The Beast Must Die, 1974. I love this movie growing it was one of those movies where I saw it a couple of times on these, like, thriller shows after school. They would show horror movies, like, I think it was, like, Channel 11 here in New York where I grew up, and I would watch it with my grandmother, and the premise, it starred Peter Cushing, and he's trying to hunt a werewolf, and it
Okay.
was a mystery. The plot was all a mystery. He invites all his friends over to this island, and if I remember correctly, he's like, "One of you is a werewolf, and I'm gonna find out who it is." Right? And it's like a mystery. So everybody's
Okay.
getting killed. So they played on the trope of like the detective trying to find a murderer, you know.
Uh-huh.
And there's like the intermit or the ending has like this like werewolf break where like it's like, so who do you think is the werewolf? You know, it's like I just love that. I thought that was one of the best movies ever. Every time and this was before the days of like streaming or VHS or anything. So I was like, I didn't have a copy. I was like, so when it aired, I was like, it's
Yeah.
the beast must die. It's like I love that movie. So if you have a chance to hunt it down, that's really great. Peter Cushing can do no wrong, so he was fantastic
Right.
in that.
Yeah.
But that's one of my favorite werewolf movies, and I wish they would remake that one because that's really really good. But yeah, so that was excellent. Anything else that we left out that we should talk about, or?
I think we did.
Ozzy Osbourne's "Bark at the Moon," we talk about songs. I mean, that's one that's, like, all about I mentioned it in my Jekyll and Hyde episode, but, yeah, his artwork for his album too was, like, pretty much a werewolf.
Yeah.
So that's so, yeah, werewolves. I think they deserve more credit than they have. People have to just make, I guess, stronger movies about them because it's not going away. Culture loves it. People are fascinated by it. So it's just a natural. But again, I think that's the secret. You have to make the monster side have some kind of personality or emotion
Yeah.
instead of just being a monster. I think they have to
Yeah.
have some humanity or something, so you could do that with vampires a lot, and you
Yeah.
can do that with some of these other monsters, but it can't just be, a wolf. I think you
Yeah.
gotta find that hybrid or something to kinda, bring that to life.
Well, because I was thinking about, well, when you think about vampires, I think about the Sting song "Moon Over Bourbon
Yeah,
Street,"
great
right?
song.
And so, it's in the mind of the vampire, and that's the same as like Interview with the Vampire and Anne Rice. I think why the werewolf or the wolves have been used in fantasy literature so much is because you can write in the mind
Exactly.
of the animal and you get that sympathy. It's a little bit harder to do, I think, visually
That's a good point.
on a screen, but I'm sure it can be done.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll see what comes of it. I'm sure there will be more to come, but I think that wraps it up for now. Thank you, Vin. This has been good.
Thank you.
Thank you to the listeners who have been listening to us from beginning to end. Share this episode, comment on it, let us know what we left out, follow us, and until next time, I am Nick,
And I'm Vin.
and we will see you next time on Paranormal Podcast.